There's a moment most people don't notice right away. When someone they have known for years begins to treat them just a little differently. Not enough to confront, not enough to name, but enough that something feels off. And the strange part is, by the time you fully understand what changed, it's already been happening for a long while. If any part of that feels familiar, stay with this. There's a reason certain distances don't arrive all at once. And understanding them may shift the way you see your own relationships. It doesn't usually begin with a conflict. No argument, no clear turning point. Just small, almost forgettable moments. A call not returned. A message answered hours later, then days. A story you share that receives a polite nod instead of real interest. At first you explain it away. They're busy. Life happens, people have their own worries, and that's true. But something else quietly unfolds underneath those reasonable explanations. People don't always leave dramatically. More often, they withdraw in increments. You might notice it during a conversation. You're speaking the same way you always have, but they seem slightly elsewhere. Not distracted in an obvious way, just not fully there. Their responses become shorter. Their curiosity fades. They no longer ask the follow-up questions they once did without thinking. It's subtle, but it accumulates. There's a particular kind of silence that begins to grow, not the comfortable kind, but one that feels like something is being held back. As if the relationship has shifted into a different room and no one announced the move. And here's the uncomfortable truth. When someone's emotional investment changes, their behavior adjusts before their words do. They may still say, "Of course I care." They may still show up occasionally, but the consistency, that's where the real story is told. There's another sign people often overlook. You start editing yourself around them, not in a dramatic way, just small adjustments. You think twice before sharing something personal. You simplify your stories. You avoid topics that used to come naturally. And if you pause long enough to notice, you might realize you're doing their part of the emotional work for them. That's when something important has already shifted. Let me pause here for a moment. Think of one person in your life who used to feel easy to talk to. Someone where conversations flowed without effort. Now ask yourself, when was the last time it felt that way? Sometimes the answer comes quickly. Sometimes it doesn't. And that hesitation says more than you might expect. Another pattern appears in how time is given. When someone values a connection, they don't just find time. They protect it. They make room for it even when life is full. But when priorities change, time becomes conditional. You are fitted into the leftover spaces. It's not always intentional. That's what makes it harder to accept. Because you're not reacting to something clearly wrong. You're reacting to something quietly different. And people often doubt themselves in that space. Maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe I expect too much. And maybe this is just how things evolve. Sometimes it is. Relationships do change. Life reshapes people in ways no one can fully control. But not all distance is neutral. Some distance is a signal. And recognizing the difference requires honesty that many people avoid. Here's where it becomes more complex. Not every withdrawal is about losing interest. Sometimes it reflects something internal in the other person. Fatigue, emotional burnout, unresolved stress, even unspoken resentment. People don't always communicate these things clearly, especially after years of familiarity. They assume you will understand without explanation. But understanding doesn't mean accepting silent disconnection. There's a quiet shift that happens in long relationships where effort becomes assumed instead of expressed. People stop tending to the connection because they believe it will sustain itself. It doesn't. Even the longest bonds require attention. Not grand gestures, just presence. Consistent, genuine presence. Without it, the relationship doesn't break. It thins. And thinning is harder to confront than breaking, because nothing is clearly wrong. But nothing feels fully right either. If this resonates with you, take a moment, not to judge the other person, but to notice your own experience more honestly. Sometimes clarity begins there. Now, there's a pattern that surprises many people. When someone begins to pull away, the other person often leans in more. They try to restore what used to feel natural. They reach out more often. They become more attentive, more accommodating. They try to be easier to be around. And without realizing it, they start abandoning parts of themselves to maintain the connection. That rarely works, because connection isn't restored through imbalance. If one person is investing more while the other is slowly stepping back, the relationship doesn't stabilize. It tilts. And over time, that tilt becomes exhausting. Here's the difficult part. People don't always recognize when they've stayed too long in a one-sided emotional space. Not because they lack awareness, but because they remember how it used to be. Memory keeps them invested. They're not responding to the present. They're holding on to the past. And that gap between what was and what is can quietly wear someone down. There's a moment, usually subtle, when something inside begins to shift. You stop expecting immediate replies. You stop sharing certain thoughts. You stop assuming that they'll understand you the way they once did. That's not detachment in a dramatic sense, it's adjustment. And adjustment is often the beginning of emotional self-protection. But here's something not often said out loud. Not all distance is a loss. Sometimes it reveals the true shape of a relationship. When the effort fades, what remains is the reality, not the memory, not the potential, not the history, just the present connection, exactly as it is. And that clarity, while uncomfortable, is valuable because it allows a different kind of decision, not a reaction driven by hurt, but a response grounded in self-respect. This is where many people pause. They wonder, should I say something? Should I address it? Or should I simply accept the shift and move on quietly? There isn't a single correct answer, but there is one question that matters more than the others. Does this relationship still feel mutual? Not perfect, not constant, just mutual. If the answer is no, or even uncertain, then something important is already asking for your attention. And ignoring that feeling doesn't preserve the relationship. It only delays an inevitable clarity. Let me slow this down for a second. There's a kind of dignity in recognizing when something has changed, without forcing it back into what it used to be. No confrontation, no resentment, just a quiet understanding that not everything is meant to stay the same forever. And that's not failure. That's reality. Now here's a shift in perspective that many people resist at first. Sometimes the other person isn't slowly leaving you. They've already adjusted their place in your life and haven't told you directly. Their actions have already made the decision. And what you're feeling isn't confusion. It's recognition. Recognition just takes time to fully surface. This is where emotional maturity becomes visible, not in how long you hold on, but in how clearly you see what's in front of you. You don't need dramatic endings to validate your experience. You don't need explanations for every change. Sometimes behavior is the explanation, and sometimes silence is the answer. That realization can feel sharp, unexpectedly so, but it also brings a certain steadiness, because once you stop trying to interpret mixed signals, you begin to trust what you consistently observe, and trust in your own perception changes everything. You become less reactive, less anxious, less dependent on reassurance, and not because you care less, but because you understand more. As we come toward the end of this reflection, there's something worth holding on to. Not every person who drifts away was meant to stay in the same way forever. And not every connection that changes is something you failed to protect. Sometimes people meet you for a certain chapter. And when that chapter closes, the relationship doesn't always end. It just no longer holds the same place. That shift can be quiet, almost invisible, but you feel it. And once you do, it's okay to respond to that feeling with honesty. Not urgency, not fear, just honesty. If this reflection stayed with you in some way, hold on to that awareness. It often shows up quietly, but it rarely arrives without reason. And sometimes, recognizing a shift is the first step toward something more grounded, more mutual, and more real. Focus Theory thanks you for listening and being part of this reflection. And maybe tonight, you'll notice something you hadn't quite named before.